Hi, everybody. This is Jimmy, and you're reading with Jimmy. We're reading Fyodor Dostoevsky's Notes from Underground, and this is part 3. Boy, this is a tough one, isn't it? Even though translated by Constance Garnett, who did a great job of translating, this is one tough reading, and I hope you're still with me. I know. Some of you may have given up already, so I'm not really talking to those who are no longer with me. I'm only talking to those who stick around to find out what the heck this narrator is talking about. Who is this guy? All right, let's get started. Welcome. We left off and this is part 3. We left off in part 2 when he was talking about the Crystal Palace, kind of like an idyllic setting versus a hen house. So he says it's his choice, my desire. That is my choice, what I call where I live. You will only eradicate it. Who's you? Don't forget what we're dealing with. He's talking in his diary. He's writing in his diary. So we're reading him talking to himself. And even though sometimes he talks to gentlemen, we have to understand that this is, in fact, first-person narration with the narrator inside the story. You will only eradicate it when you have changed my preference. Well, do change it. Allure me with something else. Give me another ideal. So he's talking to himself, to these quote-unquote gentlemen. The palace of crystal may be an idle dream, and it is inconsistent with the laws of nature, and that I have invented it only through my own stupidity, through the old-fashioned irrational habits of my generation. But what does it matter to me that it is inconsistent? Remember, he's talking about freedom of choice. This is a case where freedom versus mathematics, life is uncertain and the certainty of mathematics. So he says, what does it matter to me if what I think is inconsistent? That makes no difference since it exists in my desires. Or it rather exists as long as my desires exist. You see how he argues with himself? And you're going to say, well, Jimmy, why is that important? Why? What do I care what this guy's thinking? Because, ladies and gentlemen, that's exactly what you do when you think. You argue with yourself. Maybe not about what this guy's arguing about himself with, but you do, in fact, argue. Should you do this? Should you do that? What are the consequences of doing? You talk to yourself, and that's essentially what he's doing. Perhaps you are laughing again. Well, laugh away. I will put up with any mockery rather than pretend that I am satisfied when I am hungry. I know anyway that I will not be put off with a compromise, with a recurring zero. There's that math again. Simply because it is consistent with the laws of nature. And it actually exists. In other words, I don't care about the certainty of life. If I think it and it's in my head, that's me. I will not accept as the crown of my desires a block of buildings with tenements for the poor on a lease of 1,000 years, and perhaps with a signboard of a dentist hanging out. He's pretty flowery in his language, isn't he? Destroy my desires, eradicate my ideals. Show me something better, and I will follow you. And you will say, perhaps, that it is not worth your trouble to do that. But in that case, I can give you the same answer. We are discussing things seriously, but if you won't if you won't give me your attention, I will drop your acquaintance. Nothing to do with you. I can retreat into my underground hole. There's the Notes from Underground. Remember when Dostoevsky, the author, gave us the author's note, which we're going to read before we finish this. We're going to read it again and again and again. But he's basically saying people like this exist. I can retreat into my underground hole. Did you ever retreat to do you have an underground hole? Do you have a place where no one except you goes? Well, Jimmy, you're talking nonsense. No. I'm talking about the secrets of your soul, the secrets you don't tell anybody, including yourself sometimes. That's what this book is about. It's about you having a conversation with yourself about the truth. Let's continue. But while I am alive and have desires, I would rather my hand were withered off than to bring one brick to such a building. It's talking about an imaginary building of tenements. Don't remind me that I have just rejected the palace of crystal for the sole reason that one cannot put out one's tongue at it. Sticking out your tongue. What's that a gesture of when you stick out your tongue? Blech, right? I did not say because I am so fond of putting my tongue out. Perhaps the thing I resented was that of all your edifices, all your buildings, there has not been one at which one can put out one's tongue. In other words, I've never seen a building where I stuck out my tongue. On the contrary, I would let my tongue be cut off out of gratitude if things could be so arranged that I should lose all desire to put it out. The heck does that mean? I would let my tongue be cut off out of gratitude. This guy is, you think he's nuts? I don't think he's nuts, but he certainly has a way with him, doesn't he? Let my tongue be cut off of gratitude if things could not be arranged that I should lose all desire to put it out. In other words, I want to have the freedom to stick out my tongue at somebody. Meh. That's what he's saying. I mean, how many times have you wanted to stick out your tongue at somebody or at something? Maybe when you were little. Remember how little kids do that? Little kids do that, don't they? They stick out their tongue. Meh. It is not my fault that things cannot be so arranged, and that one must be satisfied with model flats. Then why am I made with such desires? For lofty desires. Can I have been constructed simply in order to come to the conclusion that all of my construction is a cheat? Can this be my whole purpose? I don't believe it. But you know what? I'm convinced that we underground folk ought to have been kept on a curb. This right here I highlighted because he thinks there's more of him. We ought to be kept on a curb. Though we may sit for 40 years underground without speaking, when we do come out into the light of day and break out, we talk and talk and talk and talk. Alienation is the word that comes to mind. I should have probably wrote that down. Alienation. Number 11. The long and short of it, gentlemen, is that it is better to do nothing. It's better conscious inertia. And so hooray for underground. Though I have said that I envy the normal man to the last drop of my bile, yet I should not care to be in his place, such as he is now, though I should not cease envying him. So he's telling us he's not like other people. He said that he envies the normal man, but don't forget he's full of spite. Remember? Don't forget that opening. No. Anyway, the underground life is more advantageous. There, at any rate, one can see the dots, see the ellipses. See that? One can. Oh, but even now I'm lying. I am lying because I know myself that it is not underground that's better, but something different, quite different, for which I am thirsting, for which I cannot find. Damn underground. So he's not satisfied with being, quote unquote, underground. What does that mean? Being alone? Being alone with your thoughts? I will tell you another thing that would be better, and that is if I myself believed in anything of what I had just written. Why are you laughing, Jimmy? Well, I'm laughing because I want you to read this again. I will tell you another thing that would be better. Better than what? What he just talked about in that paragraph. Right? If I myself believed in anything of what I have just written. In other words, is he BSing us or BSing himself? Do you lie to yourself? Don't answer that yet. I swear to you, gentlemen, there is not one thing, not one word of what I have written that I really believe. Well, that is, I believe it, perhaps, but at the same time I feel and suspect that I am lying like a cobbler. Quote, then why have you written all this, you will say to me. End quote. Quote, well, I ought to put you underground for 40 years, like I have been, without anything to do, and then come to you in your cellar to find at what stage you have reached. How can a man be left with nothing to do for 40 years? Isn't that shameful? Isn't that humiliating, you will say. So I wrote a note here. Who is he talking to? Who's speaking? When he does these quotes, he's talking to himself, isn't he? He's talking to himself. These gentlemen are him. They're a figment of his imagination, and he's addressing like a jury, right? Isn't that shameful? Isn't that humiliating, you will say, perhaps, wagging your heads contemptuously. Quote, you thirst for life, and try to settle the problems of life by logical tangle. And how persistent, how insolent are your sallies, your verbal escapades. And at the same time, what a scare you are in, right? You talk nonsense and are pleased with it. You say impudent things and are in a continual alarm and apologizing for them. You declare that you are afraid of nothing, and at the same time, you try to ingrate yourself in our good opinion. You declare that you are gnashing your teeth, and at the same time, you try to be witty so as to amuse us. Who's us? Who's talking here? The gentleman. It's him himself. It's society, right? He's an outcast. He's underground. He's talking to these gentlemen. And the gentlemen are now talking back to him. You know that your witticisms, they're not witty, but you are evidently well satisfied with their literary value. You may perhaps have really suffered, I don't know, but you have no respect for your own suffering. You may have sincerity, right? But you have no modesty. You have no modesty. Out of the prettiest vanity, you expose your sincerity to publicity and ignominy. It's that. You doubtlessly mean to say something, but you hide your last word through fear, because you have not the resolution to utter it, and you only have cowardly impudence. You boast of consciousness, but you are not sure of your ground, for though your mind works, yet your heart is darkened and corrupt, and you cannot have a full, genuine consciousness with an impure heart, without a pure heart. Pardon me. And how intrusive you are, and how you insist and grimace. Lies, 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 say the gentleman, right? Of course, I have myself made up all the things you say. You know what schizophrenia is? It's like a dual personality. He's bordering on this, isn't he? Of course, I have made up the things that you say. It's really him, right? That too is from the underground. I have been for 40 years listening to you through a crack under the floor, and I have invented them myself because there was nothing else I could invent. It is no wonder that I have learned it by heart, and it has taken a literary form. So the Notes from Underground, the diary, is a literary piece of work, which is what Dostoevsky said in the author's introduction, the note, that he found these papers. But can you really be so credulous as to think that I will print all this and give it to you to read too? And another problem, why do I call you gentlemen? Why do I address you as though you were my readers? Such confessions I intend to make are never printed, nor are they given to other people to read. Anyway, I am not strong-minded enough for that, and I don't see why I should be. But you see, a fancy has occurred to me, and I want to realize it at all costs. Let me explain. Every man has reminiscences, which he would not tell to everyone, but only to his friends. Isn't that a profound statement? And don't forget, he's talking about man in the universal sense. It's also women. Every man has reminiscences which he would not tell to everyone, but only to his friends. He has other matters in his mind which he would not reveal even to his friends, but only to himself, and that in secret. But there are other things which a man is afraid to tell even to himself. And every decent man has a number of such things stored away in his mind. Now, if you don't believe that, if you don't believe this to be true, and he is a first-person narrator, so he could be lying. In fact, he just admitted in the previous page that everything he's been saying is a bunch of lies. But I don't think he's lying. He's arguing with himself. So this is the essence. I should have marked that whole paragraph, right? This is one of the keys to the puzzle. This right here. Right? We tell certain things to friends. We have other things we don't tell to our friends, only to ourselves in secret. And still there's even other things that we won't even admit to ourselves. And every decent man has a number of such things. Do you believe that? The more decent a man is, the greater number of such things in his mind. All these things. Anyway, I have only lately determined to remember some of my early adventures. Remember, he's 40 years old, right? Till now, I have always avoided them, even with a certain uneasiness. Now, when I am not only recalling them, but have actually decided to write an account of them, I want to try the experiment whether one can, even with oneself, be perfectly open and not take fright at the whole truth. So here is the essence of what we're learning about this guy. He's trying to take and put down on paper those things about himself that he was afraid to admit to himself. I will observe in parentheses that Heine says that a true autobiography is almost an impossibility and that man is bound to lie about himself. Heinrich Heine is a prominent 19th century German poet. So remember, this guy is educated and he has references here, right? So Heine refers to Heine. But rather his lyrical poetry, social commentary, incorporating elements of personal experience in his broader works, blah, blah, blah. So you can look him up and actually read about Heinrich Heine. Then he also says he considers that Rousseau, now who's Rousseau, right? Let's go back up here. Whoop. Jean-Jacques Rousseau, a German-born politician, moral philosopher in the Enlightenment era. He's also known for his work on the social contract. That's one of his books, which questioned the purpose and place of government and responsibility for his citizens. Rousseau was known as a romantic, okay? So he refers to Rousseau, certainly told lies about himself in his Confessions. He wrote a book about confessions and even intentionally lied out of vanity. I am convinced that Heine is right, and I quite understand how sometimes one may, out of sheer vanity, attribute regular crimes to oneself. And indeed, I can very well conceive that kind of vanity. You're vain. Oh, I did this. Vanity, vanity, all is vanity. You know the quote? But Heine judged the people who made their confessions to the public. I'm writing only for myself. And I wish to declare once and for all that if I write as though I were addressing readers, that it is simply because it's easier for me to write in that form. It is a form, an empty form. I shall never have readers. I have made this plain already. Do you believe that? We have to believe it if we're going to understand this guy. So he's not really writing to the public. He doesn't think he'll ever be read. These are his personal inmost thoughts. A diary, a journal, not meant for public viewing. Have you ever written anything like that? I don't wish to be hampered by any restrictions in the compilation of my notes. I shall not attempt any system or method. I will jot things down as I remember them. Now, so far, that's true, isn't it? There's no logic to what the hell's going on. We're still confused. But now we're getting to the gist of it. It's a kind of a confession, isn't it? But here, perhaps, someone will catch at the word and ask me, listen, if you really don't reckon on readers, why do you make such a compact with yourself and on paper too? That is, that you won't attempt any system or method and that you just jot things down as you remember them and so on and on and on. Why are you explaining this? Why do you apologize? And he says, well, there it is, I answer. And he's going to answer, okay? Why are you doing this if you don't expect anybody to read it and you're just jotting down? Remember I used the word stream of consciousness in his style? He's just writing it as it comes to his head. There is a whole psychology in all of this, though. Perhaps it is simply that I am a coward. That's interesting. Let me mark that. Maybe I'm just a coward. You know what a coward is, right? And perhaps that I purposely imagine an audience before me in order that I may be more dignified while I write this. There are perhaps thousands of reasons. Again, what is my object precisely in writing? If it is not for the benefit of the public, why should I simply recall these incidents in my own mind without putting them on paper? Why don't I just think about this stuff? Quite so. But yet, it is more imposing on paper. I told you earlier that when you put things down, when you put your thoughts down, you're really solidifying your thoughts. People don't write anymore. They use computers or they use AI, forgive me. But when you write things down as you're writing, the act of writing is a almost spiritual, don't laugh, it's almost a spiritual experience when you're writing with your pen. They don't teach penmanship anymore, right? But when you write, there's something that your thoughts are coming through your hand to the pen, to the paper. There is something more impressive in it, and I shall be better able to criticize myself and improve my style. Besides, I shall perhaps obtain actual relief from writing. Very good insight. It's therapeutic. Jimmy, how can you say that? Because I've been in therapy since I was 17. Not real therapy, but I write things down. You write things down. You should write things down. Why? Not only because of the experience, but when you look at it in the light of day the next day, sometimes you won't realize who the hell wrote this, right? Today, for instance, I am particularly oppressed by one memory of a distant past. It came to me vividly to my mind a few days ago, and it's remained haunting me like an annoying tune that one cannot get rid of. And you know what that's like when you get that song in your head? Sometimes my wife says, don't you dare whistle that song. It'll be in my head. And yet I must get rid of it somehow. And the way you get rid of it, ladies and gentlemen, is by writing it out. I have hundreds of such reminiscences, don't we all? But at times, someone stands out from the 100 and oppresses me. For some reason, I believe that if I write it down, I should get rid of it. So why not try? Besides, I'm bored. I am bored, right? I never have anything to do. Don't forget, why do we know that? Because he inherited money, right? Writing will be a sort of work. They say work makes a man kind-hearted and honest. Well, here's a chance for me to become kind-hearted and honest, right? Snow is falling today. Yellow, dingy. It fell yesterday, too, a few days ago. You know, I fancy it is wet snow that has reminded me of that incident, which I cannot shake off now. So let it be a story about falling snow. Okay. He quotes Narkozov here, who was Nikolai Andreevich Nakorov, born 1821, right? Died 1878 in Petersburg. He was a Russian poet, journalist, whose work centered on the theme of compassion for the suffering of the peasantry. Remember I told you in the analysis of the first part reading that when I was a teacher, one of the teachers that I worked with in my area asked me, who's your favorite author? I said, Dostoevsky. And she said, oh, he was concerned about the poor people. One of Dostoevsky's works is called Poor Folk. if you really say that about Dostoevsky, that is a superficial reading of what this guy's talking about. I'm just telling you. So, part 2. Remember, in the author, Dostoevsky said he found these notes. There's one part and there's 2 parts. This is the second part. The first part kind of explains what, he was jumping all around the place. And that's why I told you, if you stopped after part 2 or part 1, you missed the whole story, because here comes the story. And now we know why he's writing this, to get it out of his system. You understand? So part 2, about what's known. When from dark error's subjugation, my words of passionate exhortation had wrenched thy fainting spirit free, and withering prone in thy affliction, thou didst recall with malediction the vice that had encompassed thee. And when thy slumbering conscience, fretting the recollection, torturing flame, thou didst reveal the hideous setting of thy life's current ere I came, when suddenly I saw thee sicken, and weeping, hide thine anguished face, revolted, maddened, horror-stricken, at memories of foul disgrace. Jimmy thinks we're going to read some poetry on this website someday. And poetry requires reading and rereading and slowly reading, and it's really intense. I'm not going to do that here because we want to finish this part 3. However, you can put me on pause and reread this again slowly and listen to the words, right? Translated by Juliet Sokosh. Number 1, part 2, number 1. At that time, I was only 24. Now this is a flashback. Okay, he's 40 years old in part 1. He tells us he's 40. And now this is a flashback to when he was 24, young man. My life was even then gloomy, irregulated, and as solitary as that of a savage. I made friends with no one, and I positively avoided talking, and I buried myself more and more in my hole. At work in the office, I never looked at anyone, and I was perfectly well aware that my companions looked upon me not only as a queer fella, but even looked upon, that queer is used here in the classical sense, not gay, right? As a queer, just a different fellow, but even looked upon me, hyphen, I always fancy this, hyphen, he fancied it, he thought it, he imagined it, with a sort of loathing. Do you ever loathe? Loathing. I sometimes wonder why it was that nobody except me fancied that he was looked upon with aversion. He thinks nobody else is looked upon, right, themselves. One of the clerks had a most repulsive, pockmarked face, which positively looked villainous. I believe I should not have dared to look at anyone with such an unsightly countenance. Another had such a very dirty old uniform that there was an unpleasant odor in his proximity, and yet no one of these gentlemen showed the slightest self-consciousness, either about their clothes, or their countenance, or their character in any way. And neither of them ever imagined that they were looked upon with repulsion. If they had imagined it, they would not have minded, so long as their superiors did not look at them that way. It's clear to me now that, owing to my undoubted vanity, right, unbounded vanity, and to the high standard that I set for myself, I often looked at myself with furious discontent, which verged on loathing. He didn't like himself. And so I inwardly attributed the same feeling to everyone. Now, isn't that the truth? Don't we think about when we feel things that we attributed? Well, everybody feels like that. You see what I'm saying about this guy? His observations about himself, while you may not agree with them, they're often true. When you look at people around you, or when you feel a certain way, you think everybody has to feel like you, right? But that's not true. So it's clear to me now that owing to my unbounded vanity, I'll repeat, to the high standard, I often looked with fears that, on verge on low. So I inwardly attributed the same feeling to ever. I hated my face, for instance. I thought it was disgusting, and even suspected that there was something base in my expression. And so every day I turned up at the office that I tried to behave as independently as possible and to assume a lofty expression, so that I might not be suspected of being abject. Quote, my face may be ugly, I thought. Quote, but let it be lofty, expressive, and above all, extremely intelligent. End quote. But I was positively and painfully certain that it was almost impossible for my countenance ever to express those qualities. And what was worse of all, I thought it actually stupid looking, and that I would have been quite satisfied if I could have looked intelligent. In fact, I would have even put it with looking base if at the same time my face could have been thought strikingly intelligent. He wants to look intelligent, right? Is he vain? Is he vain? He doesn't like himself. He doesn't like himself, right? Of course, I hated my fellow clerks, one and all, and I despised them all. And yet at the same time, I was, as it were, afraid of them. In fact, it happened at times that I thought more highly of them than of myself. It somehow happened quite suddenly that I alternated between despising them and thinking them superior to me. A cultivated and decent man cannot be vain without setting a fearfully high standard for himself. And without despising, now here I wrote a note here, white feather, right? Display cowardice, as in Bob put up his fists, Bill showed the white feather and backed down. This expression comes from cockfighting. White feather, right? Find white. Put a note there, but there it is right here, white feather. We're going to come up to it. That's why I want you to read this note. He's talking about himself, his vanity. He despises everybody, and he's not satisfied with himself. So white feather will be explained shortly. A cultivated and decent man cannot be vain without setting a high standard, and without despising and almost hating himself at certain moments. But whether I despised them or I thought them superior, I dropped my eyes almost every time I met anyone. I want you to think about that. What do you do when you meet someone? Do you look them in the eye, or do you drop your eyes? He drops his eyes. I even made experiments whether I could face so-and-so's looking at me, and I was always the first one to drop my eyes. So he experiments with looking at people when they look at him to see who drops their eyes first. Who does that? This is what I'm going to make a judgment here, ladies and gentlemen. Jimmy thinks this guy's really got low self-esteem. He's just thinking too much. Or is he? Who produced a guy like this? This worried me to distraction. I had a sickly dread, too, of being ridiculous. Maybe you think he is ridiculous. And so had a slavish passion for the conventional and everything external. I loved to fall into the common rut, and had a wholehearted terror of any kind of eccentricity in myself. But how could I live up to it? I was morbidly sensitive, as a man of our age should be. There's an important comment. Morbidly sensitive. They were all stupid, and as like one another as so many sheep. He thinks he's better than people. Perhaps I was the only one in the office who fancied that I was a coward and a slave. I imagined I was a coward and a slave, and I fancied it just because I was more highly developed. Well, maybe I was a coward because I'm more intelligent than everybody, so I know I'm a coward. That is his, whose normal condition. Of that I am firmly persuaded. He is made and constructed to that very end. Who's he? And not only at the present time, think about who he is. I was more highly developed. But it was not only that I fancied it, it was really so. I was a coward slave, blah, 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 right? Perhaps I was the only one who fancied that I was a coward or slave. Of that I am firmly persuaded. He is made and constructed to the very end, and not only at the present time, owing to some casual circumstances, but always, at all times, a decent man is bound to be a coward and a slave. It is the law of nature for all decent people all over the earth. Is that true? If you're decent, you're a coward and a slave? What is a coward? What is a slave? We're going to talk about this when we analyze this guy. It is the law of nature for all decent people all over the earth. If any one of them happens to be valiant, brave about something, he need not be comforted nor carried away by that. He would show the white feather just the same before something else. There's the white feather. Display cowardice. Even if he's showing valiant, he's being valiant, he would show the white feather just the same. That is how invariably and inevitably it ends. Only donkeys and mules are valiant. And they only till they are pushed to the wall. Remember he talked about the wall? It is not worthwhile to pay attention to them, for they really are of no consequence. People who don't think, who just act. People. So this guy, because he thinks a lot, people who just act and don't think are of no consequence. Another circumstances too worried me in those days, that there was no one like me, and I was unlike anyone else. Quote, I am alone, and they are everyone, I thought, and I pondered. From that, it is evident that I was still a youngster, because he thinks no one's like him. The very opposite sometimes happened. It was lonesome sometimes to go to the office. Things reached such a point that I often came home ill. But all at once, apropos about nothing, there would be some phase of skepticism, indifference. Everything happened to me in phases, and I would laugh at myself for my intolerance and fastidiousness. And I would reproach myself with being romantic. I'm just a romantic. At one time, I was unwilling to speak to anyone. What's fastidiousness? The quality of being concerned with tidiness and an order, a neat freak, right? Fastidiousness, right? I would laugh at myself at my intolerance and my fastidiousness. One time I was unwilling to speak to anyone, while at other times I would not only talk, but I would go to the length of contemplating making friends with them. All of my fastidiousness would suddenly, for no rhyme or reason, vanish. Who knows? Perhaps I never really had it. And it had simply been affected, pretended. And I got it out of books. See how this guy's really a mess upstairs, isn't he? I have not decided that question even now. Once, I quite made friends with them. I visited their homes and I played preference. I drank vodka and talked about promotions, ... But here, let me make a digression. We Russians, speaking generally, have never had those foolish transcendental romantics. What's a transcendental romantic? Here's the definition. Someone who adheres to the philosophy of transcendentalism. Sometimes I hate definitions, don't you? So you got to now look up transcendentalism, which I did, which is a movement deeply rooted in romantic ideals of valuing intuition, emotion, and beauty of nature over reason. There's always this tug of war between reasoning, right, and feelings, right? There's always these arguments going on in your head. And while also emphasizing individual self-reliance, one of the great American transcendentalists is Ralph Waldo Emerson, and I encourage you to read him. We're going to read Self-Reliance on this website if we haven't done so already. One of the great essays of all time. Okay, and the inherent divinity within each person finding connection to God through the natural world. Okay, good. So he's saying we Russians, generally speaking, had never had foolish transcendental German and still more French, on whom nothing produces any effect. If there were an earthquake, if all France suddenly perished at the barricades, they would still be the same. They would not even have the decency to effect a change, but would still go on singing their transcendental songs to the hour of their death, because they are all fools. But we in Russia, we have no fools. Is he being ironic? That is well known. That is what distinguishes us from foreign lands. Consequently, now, if you're not Russian or you are Russian, this is important. He's talking about his country. That's where right? He's talking about him. These transcendental natures are not found amongst us in the pure form. The idea that they are is due. Remember, this is what? He's going to make a little digression. The idea that they are is due to our realistic journalists and critics of the day who always look out for the Koskungols and Uncle Peter Ivaniches and foolishly accepting them as our ideal. And they have slandered our romantics. One second. Sorry about that. I had to pause for a minute. I got a call from a client. Anyway, on the contrary, the characteristics of our romantics are absolutely and directly opposed to the transcendental European type, and no European standard can be applied to them. Parentheses, allow me to make use of this word romantic, hyphen, an old-fashioned and much respected word, which has done good service and is familiar to all, close parentheses. The characteristic of our romantic, right, our two characteristics are to understand everything, to see everything, and to see it often, incomparably, more clearly than our most realistic minds see it. To refuse to accept anyone or anything, but at the same time, not to despise anything, to give way, to yield from policy, and never to lose sight of a useful, practical object, parentheses, such as rent-free quarters at the government expense, pensions, decorations, close parentheses, to see their eye on that object through all the enthusiasms and volumes of lyrical poems, and at the same time, to preserve the good, the beautiful, inviolate within them to the hour of their death. Boy, he gets carried away, doesn't he? And to preserve themselves also, incidentally, like some precious jewel wrapped in cotton wool, if only for the benefit of the good and the beautiful. Our romantic is a man of great breadth and of the greatest rogue of all of our rogues. And I assure you, I can assure you from experience indeed, of course, that if he is intelligent, but what am I saying? The romantic is always intelligent. And I only meant to observe that although we have had foolish romantics, they don't count. And that they were only so because in the flower of their youth, they degenerated into Germans, and to preserve their precious jewel and more comfortably settled somewhere out there by preference of Weimar or the Black Forest. Right? I, for instance, generally despised my official work, and I didn't openly abuse it simply because I was in it myself and I got a salary for it. Anyway, take note. I did not openly abuse it. Our romantic would rather go out of his mind. A thing, however, which very rarely happens, than to take an open abuse, unless he had some other career in view, and he never kicked out. At most, they would take him to the lunatic asylum as the King of Spain, if he should ever go mad. This is a reference to Nikolai Gogol, right? In The Diary of a Madman, which Jimmy read on this website. He went nuts and thought he was the King of Spain. That's a good book to read, to get another viewpoint. But it is also only thin, fair people who go out of their minds in Russia. Remember that. Innumerable romantics attain later in life to consider the rank in the service. Their many-sidedness is remarkable. And what a faculty they have for the most contradictory sensations. I was comforted by all of this. Thought even in those days, and I am sure the same opinion now. That is why there is so many broad natures among us. who never lose their ideal, even in the depths of degradation. And though they never stir a finger for their ideal, in other words, they never try to get whatever they're thinking about that's ideal, though they aren't thieves and knaves, yet they are tearfully cherished their first ideal and an extraordinary honest at heart. Yes, it is only among us that the most incorrigible rogue can be absolutely and loftily honest at heart, without in the least ceasing to be a rogue. What the heck is he talking about? I repeat, our romantics frequently become such accomplished rascals, parentheses, and I use the term rascals affectionately. He's getting carried away with his own voice, isn't he? He already said he does that. Suddenly displays such a sense of reality and practical knowledge that their bewilderment, their bewildered superiors and the public generally can only ejaculate in amazement. That's an interesting word, isn't it? They can only be amazed. Their many-sidedness is really amazing, and goodness knows what it will develop into later on and what the future has in store for us. It is not a poor material. I do not say this from any foolish or boastful patriotism, but I feel for sure that you are again imagining that maybe I'm joking, or perhaps it's contrary, and that you are convinced that I really think so. Anyway, gentlemen, I shall welcome both views as an honor and a special favor, and do forgive my digression. So all the way from here, his digression starts here, and he goes here. Oh, what the heck is this? Can we just skip this and cut to the chase? Well, think about that. We can go back and reread that, so we're back to the story. I did not, of course, maintain friendly relations with my comrades. Remember, this is when he was a young man. And soon I was at loggerheads with them. Disagreement, loggerheads. And in my youth and inexperience, I even gave up bowing to them as though I had cut off relations. When people in this day and age, when he was writing this, that when they would meet, they would bow. They would bow. Some people still bow today. That, however, only happened to me once. As a rule, I was always alone. In the first place, I spent most of my time at home reading. I tried to stifle all that was continually seething in me by means of external impressions. And the only external, I was reading. I was always reading. Reading, of course, was a great help, and it exciting me, giving me pleasure, pain. But at times it bored me fearfully. One longed for movement in spite of everything, and I plunged all at once into dark, underground, lonesome vice of the pettiest kind. You know what vice is, right? My wretched passions were acute, smarting, hurting from my continual, sickly irritability, and I had hysterical impulses with tears and convulsions. I had no recourse except reading. And that is, there was nothing in my surroundings which I could respect and which attracted me. And I was overwhelmed with depression, too, and I had a hysterical craving for incongruity and for contrast. And so I took to vice. I have not said all of this to justify myself. No, I'm lying. I did want to justify myself. I make very little observation for my own benefit, gentlemen. I don't want to lie. I vowed to myself that I would not lie. And so, furtively, timidly, in solitude at night, I indulged in filthy vice with a feeling of shame which never deserted me, even at the most lonesome moments and at which such moments nearly made me curse. Already even then I had my underground world in my soul. I was fearfully afraid of being seen, of being met, of being recognized. Remember what he's talking about the secrets that people, men, women, do not tell even to themselves. And what is this filthy vice he's talking about? I'm going to leave that to your imagination. You think about this. I was fearfully afraid of being seen. I visited various obscure haunts. One night I was passing a tavern and I saw through a lighted window some gentlemen fighting with billiard cues. And I saw one of them thrown out of the window. Other times I should have felt very disgusted. But I was in such a mood at the time that I actually envied that gentleman thrown out of the window. Jimmy put a question mark here, double question mark. He was walking by, he saw someone fighting with billiard cues, and one of those guys comes flying through the window, and he envies him. You know what envy is, right? And I envied him so much that I even went into the tavern and into the billiard room. Perhaps, I thought, I'll have a fight too, and they'll throw me out of the window. I shouldn't laugh. Think about that. He's so desperate for attention. I wasn't drunk, but what is one to do? Depression will drive a man to such a pitch of hysteria. Have you ever been depressed? Sorry. Have you ever been depressed? But nothing happened. It seemed that I was not even equal to being thrown out of a window, and so I went away without having my fight. Look at this. Look at this. An officer put me in my place from the first moment. I was standing by the building. Now he's recalling an incident that's in his head. Pay attention. I was standing by the billiard table in my ignorance, blocking up the way, and he wanted to pass. So he took me by the shoulders, and without a word, without a warning or explanation, he moved me from where I was standing to another spot, and he passed by as though he had not noticed me. I could have forgiven blows, but I could not forgive his having moved me without noticing me. Devil knows what I would have given for a real regular quarrel, a more decent, more literary one, so to speak. I had been treated like a fly, and this officer was over 6 foot. Well, I was a spindly little fellow. But the quarrel was in my hands. I had only to protest, and I certainly would have been thrown out that window, but I changed my mind, and I preferred to beat a resentful retreat. I went out of the tavern straight home, confused, troubled, and the next night I went out again with the same lewd intentions. Remember, he's a vice, right? And still more fruitively, abjectly, and miserably than before, as it were, with tears in my eyes. But I still did go out again. Now, don't imagine, though, that it was cowardice that made me slink away from that officer. I've never been a coward at heart, though I have always been a coward in action. Sorry. I shouldn't laugh. You shouldn't laugh. Don't imagine I've never been a coward at heart, though I should always have been a coward in action. And you're going to say, why don't you just pop the guy? Well, that's what we're talking about. Men of action and men in their mind who are men of action. Don't be in a hurry to laugh. See, he's telling me. I assure you, I can explain it all. Well, let's go, buddy. Oh, if only the officer had been one of the sort who would consent to fight a duel. But no, he was one of those gentlemen, parentheses, alas, long extinct, who preferred fighting with cues, or like Google's Lieutenant Pirgroff appealing to the police. So there's a little note on the bottom here. Lieutenant Pirgroff is a character from Gogol's short story, Nevsky Prospect, where he is depicted as a cynical and crude military officer who attempts to seduce a woman on the street only to be caught and humiliated by her husband, essentially serving as a foil to a more idealistic blah, blah, blah. So remember, this guy's educated, he's well-read, and he reads books all the time, and he lives in books, and he tries to take what he lives in books to the outside world. That's the main problem. There's nothing wrong with reading like we're reading with Jimmy, but we're reading. Why are we reading? We're reading to learn how other people lead their lives so that we know how to lead ours. What does that mean, Jimmy? That if we're walking by, we see people fighting, and we go in there, we expect to do fight. Why didn't the narrator fight? Why didn't he go in there and just start laying on and pick a fight? Why didn't he do that? Think about that. They did not fight duels and would have thought a duel with a civilian like me utterly unseemly procedure in any case. And they, study duels sometimes too. And they looked upon the duel altogether as something impossible, something free thinking, something French. But they were quite ready to bully, especially when they were over 6 feet. This is called rationalization. I did not slink away through cowardice, but through unbounded vanity. I wasn't afraid of this 6 foot, nor of getting a sound thrashing or being thrown out of the window. I should have had a physical courage enough, I assure you, but I had not the moral courage. Adjective modifying courage. Physical modifying courage. He didn't have moral courage. What's that? What I was afraid of was that everyone present, even from the insolent marker down to the lowest little stinking pimply clerk in a greasy collar, would jeer at me and fail to understand that when I began to protest and to address them in literary language. For the point of honor, not of honor, but of the point of honor, one cannot speak among us except in literary language. You can't allude to the point of honor in ordinary language. I was fully convinced, the sense of reality, in spite of all my romanticism, that they would all simply split their sides with laughter, and that the officer would not simply beat me, that is, without insulting me. He would certainly prod me in the back with a knee and kick me around the billiard table, and only then perhaps have pity and drop me out of the window. So in his own mind, he's trying to make this a bigger deal than it perhaps is, right? Of course, this trivial incident could not with me end in that. Pay attention. I often met that officer afterwards in the street, and I noticed him very carefully. I'm not quite sure whether he recognized me. Well, I imagine not. I judge from certain signs. Do you think he recognized them? But I stared at him with spite and hatred. And so it went on for several years. My resentment grew even deeper with years. At first, I began making stealthy inquiries about this officer. It was difficult for me to do so, for I didn't know anyone. But one day I heard someone shout his surname in the street, and as I was following him at a distance, as though I were tied to him, so I learnt his surname. And another time I followed him to his flat, and for 10 kopecks I learned from the porter where he lived, on which story, and whether he lived alone or with others, and so on. In fact, Jesus, holy mackerel, this guy's a stalker, isn't he? In fact, everything one could learn from a porter. One morning, though I had never tried my hand with a pen, it suddenly occurred to me to write a satire on this officer in the form of a novel, which would unmask his villainy. What villainy is he talking about? I wrote the novel with relish. I did unmask his villainy. I even exaggerated it. And at first I so altered his surname, that is, so it could be easily recognized. But on second thoughts, I changed it. And I sent the story to Lovetsky Zabasky. But at that time, such attacks were not the fashion, so my story was not printed. That was a great vexation to me. Sometimes I was positively choked with resentment. Okay. At last I determined to challenge my enemy to a duel. I composed a splendid, charming letter to him, imploring him to apologize to me, and hinting rather plainly at a duel in case of refusal. The letter was so composed that if the officer had the least understanding of the good and the beautiful, he would certainly have flung himself on my neck and have offered me his friendship. And how fine that would have been. How we should have gotten on together. Quote, he could have shielded me with his higher rank, while I could have improved his mind with my culture. And while my ideas and all sorts of things might have happened. End quote. Only fancy, this was 2 years after his insult to me. His insult to me. What was the insult to him? Remember, he moved him aside. And my challenge would have been ridiculous anarchism, anachronism. What's that? Well, It's a thing belonging and appropriate to a period other than which it exists. It's out of sync. In spite of all the ingenuity of my letter in discussing and explaining away anachronism. But thank God to this day, and I thank the Almighty with tears in my eyes, I didn't send the letter. Cold shivers run down my back when I think what might have happened if I did send the letter. And all at once I revenged myself in the simplest way, by a stroke of genius. A brilliant thought suddenly dawned on me. Sometimes on holidays, I used to stroll along the sunny side of the Nevsky, about 4 o'clock in the afternoon, and though it was hardly a stroll so much as a series of innumerable miseries, humiliations, resentments, but no doubt that was just what I wanted. I used to wiggle along in the most unseemly fashion, like an eel, continually moving aside to make way for generals, for officers, or the guards and the hussars, or for the ladies. At such minutes, there used to be convulsive twinges in my heart, and I used to feel hot all down my neck at the mere thought of the wretchedness of my attire, of the wretchedness and abjectness of my little scurrying figure along there. This was a regular martyrdom for me, a continual intolerable humiliation at the thought, which passed into an incessant and direct sensation that I was a mere fly in the eyes of all this world, a nasty, disgusting fly. More intelligent, more highly developed, more refined in feelings than any of them, of course, but I was a fly that was continually making way for everyone. In other words, when he walked, he would give way to the people, insulted and injured and by everyone. Now imagine you're doing that when you're walking and it's a narrow path. Do you give way to people or do they give way to you? Do you bump people or do they bump into you? This is what this guy's doing for what? Humiliation? Why I inflicted this torture on myself, why I went to Nevsky, I don't know. I simply felt drawn there at every possible opportunity. Someone who likes to torture himself is called machoistic, right? A machoist. I can't even pronounce it anymore. Like a sadist. A masochist. A masochist is someone who likes to be tortured by other people. A masochist. Masochist. Sorry for that, for that slip. Is he a masochist? He's got a little twinge of that, doesn't he? Already then I began to experience such a rush of enjoyment which I spoke of in the first chapter. After my affair with the officer, I felt even more drawn there before. It was on the Nevsky that I met him most frequently. Right? There I could admire him. He too went there chiefly on holidays. He too turned out of his path for generals and persons of high rank. And he too wiggled between them like an eel. But people like me, or even better dressed like me, he simply walked over. He made straight for them as though there were nothing but empty space before him, and he never, under any circumstances, turned aside. I gloated over my resentment watching him, always resentfully made way for him. It exasperated me that even in the street I couldn't be on an even footing with this guy. Quote, why must you invariably be the first to move aside, I kept asking myself in hysterical rage, walking up sometimes at 3 o'clock in the morning, waking up. Why is it you that why not him? There's no regulation about who should move first. There's no written law. Let the making way be equal, as it is usually done with refined people who meet. He moves halfway, you move halfway, and you pass with mutual effect. But that never happened, and I always moved aside, while he didn't even notice my making way for him, and lo and behold, a bright idea dawned on me. What? I thought, what if I meet him and I don't move on one side? What if I don't move aside on purpose, and even if I knock up against him, how would that be? This audacious idea took hold on me so that it gave me no peace. I kept dreaming of it continually, horribly, and I purposely went more frequently to Nevsky in order to picture more vividly how I should do it when I did do it, and I was delighted. This intention seemed to me more and more practical, possible. Quote, of course, I won't really push him, I thought. Already more good nature in my joy. I simply will not turn aside. I'll run up against them, but not violently. But there should be shouldering each other. We'll shoulder each other, just as decency permits. I'll push him against him, and he'll push against me. So at last I made up my mind completely, but my preparations took a great deal of time. To begin with, when I carried out my plan, I should need to be looking a little more decent. So I had to think of my getup. Quote, in any case of emergency, for instance, there are all sorts of public scandal, and public, therefore, show, rare, exotic, obscure. The Countess walks there, Prince D walks there. These are all the people walking along the Nevsky. I must be well dressed if I'm going to do this. Something that inspires respect of itself and puts on an equal footing in the eyes of society. With this object, I asked for some of my salary in advance, and I bought a pair of black gloves and a decent hat. He went to Turchkin's. Black gloves seemed to be both dignified and bon ton than the lemon-colored ones which I had contemplated at first. The color's too gaudy. It looks as though one were trying to be conspicuous. And so I did not take the lemon-colored ones. I had got ready long before a good shirt with white bone studs. My overcoat was the only thing that held me back. The coat itself was a very good one, and it kept me warm, but it was wadded, and it had a raccoon collar, which was at the height of vulgarity, and I had to change the collar at any sacrifice, right? To have a beaver one, like an officer's. And for this purpose, I began visiting Krasny Dvor, the market, and after several attempts, I came upon a piece of German beaver. You know, these German beavers soon grow shabby and they look wretched, but at first they look really well, exceedingly well, and I only needed it for one occasion. So I asked the price, and even so, it was too expensive. So after thinking it over thoroughly, I decided to sell my raccoon collar. With the rest of the money, and a considerable sum for me, I decided to borrow from Anton Antovich Semechkin, my immediate supervisor, an unassuming person, though through grave and judicious, he never lent me money to anyone. But I had, on entering the service, been especially recommended to him by an important personage who had got me my berth. I was horribly worried. To borrow from Anton Antovich seemed to me monstrous and shameful. I didn't sleep for 2 or 3 nights. Indeed, I didn't sleep well at all that time. I was in a fever. I had a vague sinking feeling in my heart, or else throbbing. Anton Antovich was surprised at first, and then he frowned, and then he reflected. And did, after all, he lent me the money, receiving me with a written authorizations to take from my salary a fortnight later the sum that he had lent me. And in this way, everything was ready at last. The handsome beaver replaced the mean-looking raccoon, and I began by degrees to get to work. I had never done an act offhand. The plan had to be carried out skillfully, by degrees. Wow. What do you think's going to happen, ladies and gentlemen? He's going to confront this officer. He's been after him for 7 years. Holy mackerel. I'm afraid you're going to have to wait for part 4. This has been part 3. If you can't wait, hop online and start reading it now. This is good, right? Now we're getting into some action. We're getting into this guy's head. Isn't he interesting, or do you find him obnoxious and stupid? And nobody thinks like this, Jimmy. Why should I continue reading it? Think about it. If you think there are no people like this, even today, you better start reading more novels, and you better start talking to people and listening to people. You better start listening to yourself. This is Jimmy. You've been reading with Jimmy. This is Dostoevsky's Notes from Underground, Part 3. We're going to go read Part 4. Thank you for reading. Jimmy at readingwithjimmy.com. Jimmy at readingwithjimmy.com. Please email me with any questions, comments, etc. Look at the websites. There's plenty of classics, and I appreciate you being here. Enjoy the day. Be careful. Start keeping your diary.